The road stretched endlessly into the wilderness, a ribbon of cracked asphalt cutting through the dense, brooding forest. Emily and her friends, Ryan, Claire, and Jason, had been on the highway for hours, their laughter and banter fading as the sun dipped below the horizon. They were on their way to a remote cabin for a weekend getaway, but the GPS had lost signal hours ago. "Take the next left," Jason said from the back seat, peering at an outdated paper map. "It should cut through and get us there faster." Emily hesitated, but turned onto the narrow, unmarked road. It was overgrown and twisted, the pavement giving way to gravel that crunched loudly beneath the tires. The headlights pierced the darkness, illuminating the skeletal branches of the trees that leaned unnaturally close to the road. "This doesn't feel right," Claire murmured, glancing nervously out the window. "It's fine," Ryan said, though his grip on the steering wheel tightened. "It's probably just one of those old forest roads." The tension in the car thickened as the minutes dragged on. The road grew rougher, the forest denser, until it felt like they were being swallowed whole by the night. The air seemed heavier here, oppressive and damp. Emily felt a prickle of unease crawl up her spine. "Are we sure this goes anywhere?" she asked, her voice tight. Before anyone could answer, the car jolted violently. Ryan slammed on the brakes, and they lurched forward as the engine sputtered and died. The sudden silence was deafening. "What the hell was that?" Jason asked, his voice trembling. Ryan stepped out, the flashlight from his phone casting a dim glow. The front tire had sunk into a gaping pothole, and the axle was bent. "Great, just great," he muttered. Emily and Claire joined him, the cold night air biting at their skin. Jason stayed in the car, fidgeting nervously with the map. "Let's just call for help," Claire suggested, but they all knew the answer. No signal. A sound broke the silence, faint and far off, a high-pitched giggle, like a child playing. Emily froze. "Did you hear that?" Ryan waved it off. "Probably an animal." But then it came again, closer this time, a chilling, childlike laugh that didn't belong in the middle of the forest. Claire grabbed Emily's arm. "We need to leave. Now." As if in response, the laughter stopped, replaced by the faint crunch of leaves and twigs snapping. Someone or something was moving through the woods. Jason locked the car doors as Ryan swept the flashlight across the trees, the beam trembling in his hand. "Hello?" Ryan called out, his voice wavering. "Is someone there?" No answer. Just the oppressive quiet of the forest. Emily's chest tightened. "Let's just start walking. There has to be a house or a gas station somewhere." Reluctantly, they gathered a few essentials from the car and headed down the road, their footsteps loud in the eerie stillness. The forest seemed alive, the trees whispering secrets to each other. Shadows shifted just out of sight, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. An hour passed, then two. The road seemed endless, looping back on itself like a cruel joke. Jason was lagging behind, muttering to himself, "This isn't right. We should have hit something by now." "Keep moving," Ryan urged, but his bravado was fading. The laughter returned, louder now, echoing from all around them. Claire broke into a run, panic overtaking her. "Claire, wait!" Emily shouted, but it was too late. Claire disappeared into the trees, her scream cutting through the night like a blade. They stopped in their tracks, fear paralyzing them. Ryan yelled her name, plunging into the forest after her, leaving Emily and Jason alone on the road. The flashlight beam bobbed erratically as Jason shook it, his breathing ragged. "Do you think she's—" Jason began, but the words died in his throat as a figure emerged from the shadows. It was a child, no older than 7, with matted hair and hollow eyes that gleamed in the light. The child tilted its head, smiling unnaturally wide. Emily stepped back, her stomach twisting. "Are you lost?" the child asked, its voice sweet and melodic. Too sweet, too perfect. Jason stammered, "W, we're just trying to—" The child's smile widened impossibly, revealing rows of jagged teeth. It lunged forward with inhuman speed, and Jason screamed as he was dragged into the darkness. Emily stumbled back, her heart hammering as she turned and ran. The forest closed in around her, branches clawing at her clothes and skin. She didn't stop, even when her legs burned and her lungs screamed for air. The laughter followed her, weaving through the trees like a sinister melody. Finally, she burst into a clearing, the road stretching before her. A single light flickered in the distance, a gas station. Relief flooded her, and she sprinted toward it, bursting through the doors. The clerk looked up from behind the counter, his expression unreadable. "You lost?" "Yes," Emily gasped. "My friends, they're pleas. You have to help." The clerk's eyes darkened, and he glanced out the window. The laughter echoed faintly in the distance. "You shouldn't have taken that road," he said quietly. "What?" Emily whispered, her knees buckling. The clerk leaned in, his voice barely audible. "That road doesn't lead anywhere. It just takes people." Before Emily could respond, the lights flickered and went out. The laughter swelled, drowning her screams as the darkness consumed her. The storm raged outside, a torrent of rain slamming against the windshield as Samantha drove down the deserted highway. Her knuckles were white as she gripped the steering wheel, eyes straining to see through the sheets of water. She had left work late, and now the familiar route home felt like a labyrinth in the downpour. The GPS stuttered, its signal weak. "Rerouting," the robotic voice repeated, growing more distorted with every turn. She glanced at the dim screen, trying to make sense of it, when a sign loomed out of the darkness. "Detour" was scrawled across the wet wood in faded red paint. An arrow pointed left, down an unlit side road. She hesitated, debating whether to trust the sign, but the highway ahead was blocked by a row of construction barriers. Cursing under her breath, she turned onto the narrow road, the tires splashing through puddles. The asphalt quickly gave way to dirt, and the trees pressed closer on either side, their skeletal branches forming a canopy that blocked out even the faintest light. Samantha's car lights barely pierced the oppressive gloom. The road was eerily quiet, save for the rhythmic thunk of her windshield wipers. She tried to tune out the growing unease by fiddling with the radio, but all she got was static. Then she saw it, movement in the corner of her eye. Something darted between the trees, quick and shadowy. She tightened her grip on the wheel, telling herself it was just an animal. But a cold knot settled in her stomach when she noticed the tracks on the muddy road ahead. They weren't tire tracks. They were footprints, barefoot, large. Her heart hammered as she eased off the accelerator, scanning the trees. A low, guttural noise broke through the rain, somewhere between a growl and a human moan. She slammed her foot on the gas, the car fishtailing before regaining traction. The dirt road stretched endlessly, and the GPS was no longer offering directions, just a blank screen glowing faintly in the dark. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Samantha didn't know anymore. The road felt wrong, like it was curving in impossible ways, doubling back on itself. Every time she thought she saw the faint glow of headlights ahead, they vanished when she got closer, and then the car stalled. "No, no, no," she cried, turning the key in desperation. The engine wheezed but refused to start. Rain drummed against the roof as the car shuddered in place, the headlights casting weak beams into the misty void. She reached for her phone, but there was no service, not even a single bar. The low growl came again, closer this time. Samantha froze, her breath catching in her throat. She locked the doors, her fingers trembling. Outside, something moved in the shadows just beyond the headlights. It was tall, its outline barely discernible against the darkness. It didn't walk. It slithered, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. She watched, paralyzed, as it crept closer. The rain muffled the sound of its movement, but she could hear the wet squelch of mud under its limbs. It paused just outside the light, and she caught a glimpse of its face, or rather the lack of one. Smooth, pale skin stretched across its skull, with no features except a jagged slash where a mouth might have been. The creature let out a low, hissing laugh, and Samantha couldn't take it anymore. She scrambled out of the car, the rain soaking her instantly. She ran, not caring where she was going, her shoes slipping on the muddy ground. The laughter followed her, echoing through the trees, multiplying until it seemed to come from every direction. She stumbled into a clearing, her chest heaving. In the center stood an old, crumbling house, its windows glowing faintly with a sickly yellow light. She had no choice. Whatever was out there was closing in, and she could feel its presence like an icy hand on the back of her neck. The door creaked open as she approached, as if inviting her inside. She hesitated, but the sound of branches snapping behind her forced her to move. She stepped over the threshold, the air inside heavy with the scent of damp wood and decay. The door slammed shut behind her, and the light from outside vanished as if it had never existed. Inside, the house was a labyrinth of narrow halls and sagging walls. Samantha's footsteps echoed unnaturally, like there were a dozen other people walking just behind her. She called out, but her voice sounded small, swallowed by the oppressive silence. In the corner of her eye, she saw movement, a figure standing at the end of the hall. It was a woman, her face obscured by her long, wet hair. Samantha's breath hitched as the figure tilted its head, then began to walk toward her. The sound of bare feet slapping against the floor filled the hall. Samantha backed away, but every door she tried was locked. The figure moved faster, the wet hair parting to reveal empty eye sockets and a grin that stretched impossibly wide. Samantha turned and ran, the house shifting around her, the walls narrowing, the floors creaking under her weight. She didn't see the hole until it was too late. The ground gave way beneath her, and she fell into the darkness. Her screams were swallowed by the void, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. When she opened her eyes, she was back in her car, the engine humming quietly. The rain had stopped, and the road ahead was clear. Shaking, Samantha glanced at the GPS. It was working again, showing her location on a familiar stretch of highway, but as she drove, her headlights illuminated a sign, DEET scrawled in faded red paint. This time, there was no arrow, only the faint sound of laughter echoing through the trees. The diner sat at the crossroads of two forgotten highways, its neon sign flickering weakly against the pitch-black night. Vanessa and her boyfriend Mark had been driving for hours, lost in the maze of backroads after their GPS failed them. When the glowing sign for Earl's Diner, open 24 hours, appeared out of nowhere, it felt like a godsend. Finally, civilization, Mark muttered, pulling into the gravel lot. The place looked old, like with cracked windows and peeling paint, but it was lit and seemed open. The thought of hot coffee and directions was too tempting to pass up. Inside, the diner was almost empty. A lone waitress stood behind the counter, her back turned to them as she wiped down the surface. The jukebox in the corner hummed faintly, though no music played. A man sat in the farthest booth, his face obscured by shadows, but he didn't look up as they entered. Vanessa shivered. Something about the place felt off. But Mark was already walking to the counter, calling out cheerfully, "Hey, can we get a couple of coffees? And maybe some help with directions?" The waitress turned around slowly, a strained smile plastered on her face. Her uniform was spotless, but her eyes looked tired, sunken. "Of course," she said, her voice flat. "Take a seat." They slid into a booth near the window. The laminated menu was sticky, the pages worn thin from years of use. Vanessa glanced at Mark, who was already looking at his phone, hoping for a signal. "This place is creepy," she whispered. "It's fine," he replied distractedly. "Just a weird vibe, that's all." The waitress brought over 2 mugs of steaming coffee, setting them down without a word. Vanessa thanked her, but the woman didn't respond, just walked stiffly back to the counter. Vanessa stared into her mug. The liquid was dark, thicker than it should have been. When she lifted the cup to her lips, a rancid smell hit her nose and she gagged. "Mark, don't drink it." But Mark had already taken a sip. He grimaced, setting the cup down. "Tastes like dirt. Let's just get out of here," Vanessa urged, her unease growing. Mark sighed but nodded. He waved to the waitress. "Actually, we're good. Can you tell us how to get back to the main highway?" The waitress didn't move. She stood perfectly still, her back turned to them again. "Hello?" Mark called, louder this time. The man in the far booth shifted, his face still hidden. "You shouldn't have come here," he said, his voice a low rasp. Mark frowned. "What's that supposed to mean?" The man slowly turned his head and Vanessa's blood ran cold. His eyes were missing, empty sockets staring blindly ahead. His skin was pale and stretched tight over his skull, like a corpse that had been left too long in the sun. "You don't leave," he said simply. Vanessa grabbed Mark's arm. "Let's go. Now." They rushed to the door, but it wouldn't budge. The handle wouldn't turn, and no matter how hard Mark shoved, it stayed firmly shut. The jukebox crackled to life, playing a scratchy, distorted tune that set Vanessa's teeth on edge. The lights in the diner flickered, and when they steadied, the waitress was standing directly in front of them, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. Her smile had grown wider, stretching far past the corners of her mouth, revealing rows of sharp, yellowed teeth. "You should sit back down," she said, her voice now a guttural growl. Mark swung a chair at her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, she opened her mouth wider, her jaw unhinging like a snake's, letting out an ear-piercing screech. The man in the booth began to laugh, a dry, choking sound, as the shadows in the corners of the diner started to move. Figures emerged, their forms indistinct, as though they were made of smoke and ash. They surrounded Mark and Vanessa, their hollow eyes gleaming. "Run!" Mark shouted. grabbing Vanessa's hand. He kicked a nearby window, shattering it, and they climbed through the jagged frame, cutting themselves on the glass. The gravel crunched under their feet as they sprinted to the car. The figures followed, gliding across the ground as if they weren't bound by gravity. Mark fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking, as Vanessa screamed at him to hurry. Finally, the engine roared to life, and they sped out of the lot, the diner's neon sign flickering violently behind them. They didn't stop driving until they reached a brightly lit gas station miles down the road. Shaking, they ran inside, desperate to tell someone what had happened. The clerk listened, his expression grim. "You said it was Earl's Diner?" he asked. Vanessa nodded. The clerk shook his head. "That place burned down years ago. A fire killed everyone inside. It's just a ruin now." Vanessa and Mark stared at him, stunned. "No, it's still there," Mark insisted. "We were just inside it." The clerk looked at them sadly. "You're not the first ones to say that. People who stop there, they usually don't make it back." As if on cue, the radio behind the counter crackled. A faint voice came through, distorted and distant. It was the waitress. "You forgot your coffee." The lights in the gas station flickered. The night was unnaturally quiet as Jordan turned onto the winding mountain road, the only sound the hum of his engine and the faint rustle of leaves in the cool autumn breeze. He was heading home after visiting an old friend in a neighboring town, but a wrong turn had led him to this desolate stretch of road. His phone had died hours ago, and the GPS in his car was as outdated as the map tucked in his glove compartment. The road climbed steeply, twisting and turning, the headlights barely illuminating the dense forest on either side. Jordan felt the prickling sense of isolation creeping in. No streetlights, no houses, not even a passing car. Just him and the darkness pressing in on all sides. As he rounded a bend, he saw it. A hitchhiker standing at the side of the road. The figure was tall and lean, wearing a dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that cast their face in shadow. Jordan's stomach tightened. He wasn't in the habit of picking up strangers, especially not this far out in the middle of nowhere. But as he drove past, he caught a glimpse of the hitchhiker's hand, a pale, bony thing clutching a sign that read, "Help." Jordan's conscience warred with his unease. What if they were in real trouble? What if their car had broken down, or they were stranded in the freezing night? Against his better judgment, he slowed down and pulled over a few yards ahead. The figure approached slowly, their movements deliberate, almost too smooth. Jordan rolled down the window slightly, keeping his foot hovering over the gas pedal. "Need a lift?" he asked cautiously. The hitchhiker leaned down, and Jordan immediately regretted stopping. Their face was obscured, but their eyes glowed faintly in the dark, a dull, sickly yellow that sent a chill down his spine. "Thank you," the hitchhiker said, their voice low and gravelly, as if unused for years. Before Jordan could object, the hitchhiker opened the passenger door and climbed in, their coat brushing against the seat. They sat unnaturally still, hands folded neatly in their lap, their head tilted slightly as if listening to something distant. "Where are you headed?" Jordan asked, forcing himself to sound calm. "Just up the road," the hitchhiker replied, their tone unnervingly polite. "Not far." Jordan nodded, his grip on the steering wheel tightening as he pulled back onto the road. The air in the car felt colder now, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. He tried to focus on the road ahead, but his eyes kept darting to the hitchhiker. They never moved, never shifted in their seat, their head turned slightly toward him. "So," Jordan began, desperate to fill the silence, "what were you doing out here?" The hitchhikers smiled faintly, their teeth unnaturally sharp. "Waiting. For what?" "For someone like you." Jordan's blood ran cold. He laughed nervously, pretending he hadn't heard the ominous reply. The road stretched endlessly ahead, and no matter how far he drove, the scenery didn't seem to change. Same trees, same sharp curves. It was as if he were driving in circles. The hitchhiker suddenly turned their head fully toward him. "You took the wrong road." Jordan glanced at them, his heart pounding. "Yeah, I think so. I was trying to get back to—" "You won't find your way back," they interrupted, their glowing eyes fixed on him now. "Not from here." "What are you talking about?" Jordan snapped, his fear giving way to frustration. "Look, I'll drop you off and figure it out myself." The hitchhiker chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "You can't leave until the road lets you." Jordan slammed on the brakes, the car skidding to a halt. "Get out," he demanded, his voice shaking. The hitchhiker didn't move. "You don't understand," they said softly. "The road isn't a place. It's a choice." "What the hell does that mean?" Jordan shouted. The hitchhiker's smile widened, splitting their face in an inhuman grin. You chose to stop, and now the road chooses you. Jordan's breath caught as the headlights dimmed, the forest around them swallowing the light. The trees seemed to shift and lean closer, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The hitchhiker's form began to dissolve, their body fading into a swirling mass of shadow and mist. You'll drive, their voice echoed, now a hollow whisper. And drive, and drive. The car's engine roared to life on its own, the tires spinning as if possessed. Jordan grabbed the wheel, but it wouldn't respond. The car shot forward, the road stretching endlessly ahead. The headlights flickered, revealing fleeting glimpses of figures standing among the trees, pale, gaunt shapes with glowing eyes watching him pass. Jordan screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the roar of the engine and the unrelenting darkness. The hitchhiker's voice echoed in his ears, a cruel, mocking tone that promised no escape. Welcome to the road that never ends. The fog rolled in thick and fast, swallowing the two-lane country road in a ghostly white shroud. Mia squinted through the windshield, her knuckles tight on the steering wheel. She hadn't seen another car in nearly an hour, and the endless expanse of trees made her feel as though she were the last person alive. She was traveling to her parents' house for the weekend, but a detour sign had forced her off the main highway. Her GPS stubbornly repeated, recalculating, as the signal bar blinked out. Frustrated, Mia slapped it off the dash. She glanced at her phone. No bars. Typical. The road narrowed further as the fog thickened. It felt as though the car were gliding through clouds, the headlights barely illuminating more than a few feet ahead. She slowed down, her heart sinking when she spotted a sign up ahead, the paint chipped and nearly illegible. She could just make out the words, Brimstone Hollow, 2 miles. Never heard of it, she muttered to herself. As she continued, something about the silence unsettled her. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive, almost suffocating. The trees lining the road loomed unnaturally tall, their bare branches clawing at the sky like gnarled hands. She felt the weight of the forest pressing in, and a shiver crawled down her spine. Then, out of nowhere, she saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, completely still. Mia slammed on the brakes like the car skidding to a stop just inches away. Her heart raced as she stared. It was a woman, pale, barefoot, wearing a tattered white dress that clung to her thin frame. Her head was bowed, long black hair hiding her face. Mia rolled her window down slightly, her voice trembling. Are you okay? Do you need help? The woman didn't respond. She didn't move. Mia's stomach churned. Something wasn't right. She honked the horn, the sound loud and jarring in the stillness. The woman's head jerked upward. Mia gasped. The woman's face was hollow, her eyes wide and unseeing, her mouth stretched into a twisted, silent scream. Panic surged through Mia as the woman suddenly turned and began walking toward the car, her movements jerky and unnatural. Without thinking, Mia threw the car into reverse, the tires squealing as she backed away. But the woman didn't stop. She quickened her pace, her steps uneven but relentless. Go, 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 Mia screamed to herself, slamming the car into drive and swerving around the woman. She sped down the road, her heart pounding in her ears. The fog swallowed everything behind her, and for a brief moment she thought she was safe. Until she saw her again. The woman stood in the road, further ahead this time, staring directly at her. Mia's blood turned to ice. How had she gotten there? She didn't have time to think. She swerved again, narrowly avoiding the figure. Her hands trembled as she gripped the wheel tighter, her breath coming in short, ragged gasps. The road twisted and turned, and no matter how far she drove, the woman kept appearing. Sometimes on the side of the road, sometimes directly in her path, always closer than before. Her distorted face burned into Mia's mind. Finally, the road ended at a small, crumbling bridge. Mia's headlights illuminated a faded wooden sign. Welcome to Brimstone Hollow. The bridge creaked ominously as she drove across it. On the other side, the fog lifted slightly, revealing a small, decrepit village. The houses were old and sagging, their windows shattered, their roofs caved in. The streets were empty, and not a single light shone in the windows. Mia stopped the car, her hands shaking. This can't be right, she whispered. A sound broke the silence, a faint, rhythmic tapping. She turned her head slowly toward the passenger window. The woman was there. Her face was pressed against the glass, her empty eyes boring into Mia's. Her mouth moved silently, as though she were whispering something Mia couldn't hear. The tapping came from her long, skeletal fingers raking against the glass. Mia screamed, slamming her foot on the gas. The car shot forward, tires kicking up gravel as she sped through the empty village. But the road didn't lead out. It looped back into the same village, past the same decaying houses. No matter how many turns she took, she always ended up back at that rotting wooden sign. The tapping began again. This time it wasn't just on the window. It came from the roof, the hood, the trunk. Mia could hear faint whispers all around her, and an unintelligible chorus that seemed to grow louder with every passing second. Her vision blurred as tears streamed down her face, her screams drowned out by the cacophony. Suddenly, the car stalled. The engine sputtered and died, and the headlights flickered out, leaving her in total darkness. The tapping stopped. The silence was worse. Mia sat frozen, her breaths shallow and ragged. She didn't dare move. Then, from the back seat, she heard it, a soft, raspy voice whispering directly into her ear. "You can't leave." She didn't turn around. She couldn't. All she could do was close her eyes and pray that the darkness would take her quickly. The rain was relentless, pounding on the roof of Mason's car as he navigated the winding country roads. It was supposed to be a shortcut, a scenic detour through the countryside, but now it felt like a mistake. The storm had come out of nowhere, and his GPS was useless, stuck buffering with a spinning wheel. Worse, his phone had died an hour ago. The headlights barely cut through the rain, illuminating little more than the jagged, overgrown edges of the narrow road. Mason cursed under his breath. The trees lining the road were so dense they seemed to close in on him, their dripping branches reaching out like skeletal arms. Then he saw it. A battered wooden sign appeared in the beams of his headlights, its peeling letters just legible. "Welcome to Black Hollow." "Never heard of it," Mason muttered. But there was no turning back now. The road was too narrow, and reversing in this weather wasn't an option. The rain eased as he entered the town. The streets were eerily quiet, the old buildings leaning against one another as if they might collapse at any moment. Dim, flickering streetlights cast uneven shadows, making the entire place look like a ghost town. Not a single car or person was in sight. Mason drove slowly, scanning for any sign of life. A diner came into view, its neon sign buzzing weakly. "Open all night." Relief washed over him. Maybe someone there could help him find his way back to the main road. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside, but the place was empty. Empty booths, a long counter with cracked stools, and a jukebox in the corner playing a soft, haunting tune. A single menu lay open on the counter, yellowed with age. "Hello," Mason called. His voice echoed faintly. From the kitchen, a man emerged. He was tall and wiry, his apron stained and his face blank, almost too expressionless. "Coffee?" the man asked, his voice flat. Sure," Mason said, unsure what else to do. "Actually, I was hoping you could give me directions. I'm a little lost." The man didn't reply. He simply poured coffee into a chipped mug and set it in front of Mason. The smell was off, metallic, but Mason was too unnerved to comment. "About those directions?" he pressed. The man finally looked at him, his eyes too wide, unblinking. "No one leaves Black Hollow," he said simply. Mason laughed nervously. "Good one." "Seriously, though." "No one leaves," the man repeated, his gaze unwavering. A cold shiver ran down Mason's spine. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the coffee. "Okay, well, thanks for whatever this is. I'll just figure it out myself." He turned and hurried out, the bell jingling again as he pushed through the door. But when he stepped outside, the street looked different. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with fog, and the buildings seemed closer together, their windows dark and empty. Mason rushed to his car, his pulse quickening. He started the engine and peeled out of the lot, desperate to leave the town behind. But the road twisted in ways he didn't remember. Every turn brought him back into the heart of Black Hollow, the same diner, the same flickering streetlights. His breath hitched as he realized he wasn't alone. Figures stood at the edges of the fog, barely visible in the periphery of his headlights. They didn't move, didn't react as he sped past. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes wide and glassy. Mason's panic surged as he pressed the gas harder, but the car began to sputter. "No, no, no," he whispered, pounding the steering wheel as the engine died. The headlights flickered and went dark, plunging him into total silence. The figures stepped closer. Mason locked the doors, his shaking hands fumbling to restart the car. The key turned, but the engine wouldn't catch. His heart pounded as he glanced out the windows. The figures were circling now, their faces illuminated in the faint moonlight. Their mouths moved silently, forming words he couldn't hear. And then came the knock. It was soft at first, just a single tap on the driver's side window. Mason froze, staring straight ahead. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by another on the passenger side. He couldn't stop himself. He turned to look. A face was pressed against the glass, too close, its features wrong. The skin was waxy and stretched tight, the mouth unnaturally wide, the teeth jagged and yellow. Its eyes locked onto his, and Mason felt his entire body go cold. "Let us in," it whispered, though its mouth didn't move. The voice echoed inside his head. Mason screamed, throwing himself against the passenger door as the figures closed in. They were everywhere now, tapping on the glass, their faces crowding every window. The air grew thick, heavy, pressing down on him like a weight. Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence was deafening. Slowly, Mason turned back to the windshield. The road was gone. The town was gone. He was surrounded by endless fog, his car suspended in a white void. He couldn't tell if he was moving or if the world itself had vanished around him, and then from the fog the whisper came again, "No one leaves." Mason never did. It was nearly midnight when Claire spotted the gas station, its lone neon sign glowing faintly through the mist. She had been driving for hours on an unfamiliar back road after her GPS had rerouted her through the countryside. Her gas gauge hovered on empty, and the sight of the station was a small relief. She pulled into the lot, her tires crunching on the gravel, and turned off the engine. The station looked old, like it hadn't been renovated in decades. The windows were grimy, and a single light flickered above the entrance. The pump itself was an ancient, rusting machine with a handwritten sign taped to it, "Pay inside." Claire sighed and grabbed her wallet, stepping out of the car. The air was cold and damp, and she could hear the faint rustling of trees in the distance. The place was eerily quiet. No other cars, no voices, just the soft hum of the flickering light. When she entered, a bell above the door jingled weakly. The inside was as decrepit as the outside. Dust coated the shelves, and the overhead fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. Behind the counter sat an old man, his face lined with deep wrinkles. He didn't look up as she approached. "Hi," Claire said, trying to sound cheerful despite the creepiness of the place. "I need to fill up. How much is it per gallon?" The old man didn't respond immediately. He finally looked at her, his eyes glassy and distant. "This road isn't safe at night," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Claire blinked, caught off guard. Okay, but I really just need gas." The old man stared at her for a moment longer, then nodded slowly. "Pumps on. Fill up and leave quickly." His tone was urgent, but his expression didn't change. Claire hesitated, but the situation was already strange enough. She nodded and headed back outside, where the mist seemed thicker now. She shivered as she reached for the pump, feeling as though unseen eyes were watching her. As she filled the tank, she glanced around nervously. The mist swirled like smoke, and the forest beyond the station seemed darker than before. Shadows shifted between the trees, though there was no breeze to move them. Her heart began to race as a faint sound reached her ears, a soft, distant humming. She froze, straining to listen. The humming grew louder, becoming more distinct. It wasn't a song, not really, just a low, rhythmic noise that seemed to pulse in the air. Claire's fingers tightened on the pump handle, and she hurried to finish. "Almost done," she muttered to herself, trying to keep calm. Then she saw it. A figure stood at the edge of the forest, barely visible through the mist. It was tall, impossibly tall, and unnaturally thin. Its limbs were too long, its movements slow and deliberate as it stepped closer. The humming grew louder, reverberating in her chest. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She fumbled with the pump, yanking it out and dropping it to the ground. Without looking back, she sprinted to her car and jumped inside. Locking the doors, the engine roared to life, and she sped out of the station, gravel spraying behind her. Her hands shook as she gripped the wheel, the road winding endlessly through the dark forest. The humming hadn't stopped. It followed her, growing louder and more invasive, as though it were coming from inside her own head. Her rearview mirror caught a glimpse of movement. She looked up and nearly screamed. The figure was there, running after her. Its long, spindly limbs moved unnaturally fast, its hollow face illuminated by her taillights. "No, no, no," Claire whispered, tears streaming down her face. She pressed the gas pedal harder, the car lurching forward. The road twisted sharply and she skidded around the bend, tires squealing. For a brief moment, the figure was gone. The humming faded, leaving her in silence. But the relief was short-lived. Up ahead, the road ended abruptly at a crumbling wooden bridge. Claire slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a stop mere feet from the edge. Her chest heaved as she stared at the drop below, the dark abyss stretching endlessly into nothingness. She turned to check behind her, and her heart sank. The figure was standing in the middle of the road, and its form towering and unnatural. It cocked its head as if studying her, the humming returning louder than ever. Claire could feel it in her skull, pressing against her thoughts, drowning out her own panicked breaths. The car's headlights began to flicker, and the radio crackled to life, though she hadn't turned it on. A voice came through, distorted and faint. "Turn around." "I can't," Claire whimpered. "There's nowhere to go." The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Turn. Around." The figure took a step closer, and the car's lights went out completely. Claire was plunged into darkness, the humming now deafening. She screamed, slamming the car into reverse, her tires screeching as she backed away from the bridge. When the lights flickered back on, the road was gone. She was surrounded by forest, her car sitting in the middle of a clearing. The mist hung low, thick and oppressive. The figure was nowhere to be seen, but the humming remained, set softer now, but constant. Claire's breath hitched as she realized something else. Her gas gauge was empty, despite just filling up. The last thing she saw before the lights flickered out for good was a pair of glowing eyes emerging from the mist. The full moon hung low in the sky as Jacob drove down the deserted highway, his playlist humming softly in the background. He had been on the road for hours, heading to visit an old college friend in a remote mountain town. The night air was crisp, the kind that sent chills down your spine, even when you weren't cold. The highway stretched endlessly before him, bordered by thick, dark woods. There wasn't a single car in sight, just the occasional sound of crickets and the faint rustling of leaves. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. His headlights caught something ahead. A deer, he thought at first, standing on the shoulder of the road. But as he got closer, Jacob realized it wasn't a deer at all. It was a woman, her pale figure barely clothed, with long, tangled hair cascading over her face. She stood unnaturally still, facing the woods, her back to the road. Jacob slowed down instinctively, his heart pounding. Something felt wrong, but his curiosity got the better of him. He rolled down his window slightly as he pulled to a stop a few yards away. "Hey, are you okay?" he called out. The woman didn't move. She didn't flinch, didn't turn, just stood there, motionless. Jacob hesitated, his grip tightening on the wheel. "Do you need help?" He tried again, louder this time. Still no response. An uneasy feeling settled over him, and Jacob decided it was best to leave. Just as he reached for the gear shift, the woman moved. Slowly, she turned her head, and Jacob's breath caught in his throat. Her face was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, glistening with an unnatural shine, and her mouth was twisted into an eerie, toothless smile. She stared directly at him, her head tilting to one side as if she were studying him. Jacob's instincts screamed at him to leave, but his body froze. She began walking toward his car, her movements stiff and jerky as though she were a puppet on strings. "Hell no," Jacob muttered, slamming the car into drive and hitting the gas. The tires screeched as he sped off, his heart hammering in his chest. In the rearview mirror, he could still see her, standing in the middle of the road, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, and then she was gone. Vanished. Jacob shook his head, trying to shake the image from his mind. Just a trick of the light, a prank. Someone messing around, he told himself, though he didn't believe it. The road grew darker, the forest on either side pressing closer. His headlights barely seemed to cut through the blackness now, and the air in the car felt heavy, suffocating. Jacob turned up the music, desperate for some sense of normalcy. Then the lights on his dashboard flickered. "What the?" he started, but before he could finish, the entire car shut down. The engine sputtered and died, and he rolled to a stop in the middle of the road. No, no, no. Jacob muttered, fumbling for his phone. He clicked it on, but the screen was blank. No signal. Of course, he sat there for a moment, trying to calm his nerves. He told himself he could figure it out, that this was just a mechanical issue. But then, in the silence, he heard it. A soft tapping. It was faint at first, coming from somewhere outside the car. Tap, tap, tap. His eyes darted to the windows, but the night outside was impenetrable. Then it grew louder. The tapping turned into a rhythmic pounding coming from the roof. Jacob's stomach twisted as he realized whatever it was on top of the car. "Who's there?" he shouted, his voice cracking. The pounding stopped. A moment of silence. Then something heavy slid across the roof, the sound of nails scraping metal. Jacob's breath hitched as a face appeared in the driver's side window. It was her, the woman from the road. But her face was closer now, clearer. Her eyes bulged unnaturally, her skin paper-thin and stretched too tight over her cheekbones. Her mouth hung open, her smile impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, broken teeth. Jacob screamed, throwing himself to the passenger side. He scrambled for the door, but before he could open it, the windows shattered. Glass rained down on him as cold, skeletal hands reached through, clawing at his jacket. "No!" he yelled, kicking wildly, his legs tangling in the seatbelt. The hands gripped tighter, pulling him toward the broken window. Her face loomed closer, her breath foul and freezing against his skin. "Stay," she hissed, her voice like dry leaves rustling in the wind. "Stay, with me." Jacob fought harder, finally breaking free of her grasp. He threw open the passenger door and tumbled out, landing hard on the asphalt. He didn't look back. He just ran, sprinting down the road, his legs burning, his lungs on fire. The forest seemed alive now, the shadows shifting and whispering as he passed. The air felt thicker with every step, dragging him down, but he kept going. The sound of footsteps followed him, slow, deliberate, impossibly close. Finally he saw it, headlights in the distance. A car. He stumbled into the middle of the road, waving his arms frantically. The car screeched to a stop, and the driver, a middle-aged man, jumped out. "Are you okay?" the man asked, his face full of concern. She's back there," Jacob stammered, pointing down the road. "She's coming." The man glanced down the road, then back at Jacob, his brow furrowing. "There's no one there," he said. Jacob turned, his heart sinking. The road behind him was empty, silent. But as the man helped him into the car, Jacob caught a glimpse of the rearview mirror. She was sitting in the back seat, her wide, toothless grin glowing in the dark. Oh. Darren hated driving at night, but his boss's last-minute demands had left him no choice. The rural roads stretched endlessly, the trees on either side leaning in as if to swallow him whole. His headlights cast long, jagged shadows across the asphalt, and the occasional rustle in the woods kept his nerves on edge. He hadn't seen another car in over an hour when he noticed a strange road sign ahead. It wasn't the usual reflective green or yellow. This one was old, wooden, and splintered, with the words "Do not enter" scrawled in faded red paint. Beneath it, smaller letters read, "Turn back now." Darren laughed nervously. "Creepy," he muttered to himself, gripping the wheel tighter. He assumed it was some prank or maybe just a leftover sign from years ago. There wasn't a way to turn around anyway. The road was too narrow, with steep ditches on either side. He pressed on, but something felt wrong. The air seemed heavier, colder, and even though his windows were closed, a faint, rotting smell seeped into the car. His radio, which had been quietly playing a podcast, crackled and went silent. Up ahead, the road seemed to narrow further, the trees so close now that their branches scraped the sides of his car. Darren slowed down, his pulse quickening. That's when he saw the figure. A man stood in the middle of the road, his back to Darren, illuminated by the car's high beams. He wore a tattered coat, his hair wild and matted. He wasn't moving. Darren brought the car to a halt, his hands shaking on the wheel. He rolled down his window just a crack. "Hey, are you okay? Need some help?" The man didn't respond. "Look, I can call someone for you." Darren tried again, but the man remained still, as if he hadn't heard. A sharp knock came from the passenger window, and Darren jumped, spinning to look. No one was there. His breath quickened as the knock came again. Harder this time, echoing through the car. He fumbled to lock the doors, his fingers slipping on the button. When he looked back at the road, the man was gone. Darren's heart pounded as he scanned the woods. The underbrush was dense, the darkness impenetrable. He couldn't see anything, but he could feel it. Eyes watching him from everywhere and nowhere. Screw this, he thought, slamming his foot on the gas. The car lurched forward, speeding down the narrow road. The trees seemed closer now, their gnarled branches reaching like claws. Darren's focus was locked on the road ahead, desperate to find any sign of civilization. Then his headlights caught something else, another sign. This one was identical to the first, with the same warning. "Do not enter. Turn back now." His stomach dropped. That wasn't possible. He'd been driving in a straight line. He hadn't turned, hadn't doubled back. He was certain of it. The road began to curve sharply, and the edges seemed to fall away into darkness. Darren slowed, gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The smell was stronger now, a rancid, earthy stench that made his stomach churn. And then he saw it. A house loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the pale moonlight. It was old, its windows shattered, the roof sagging. The road ended abruptly in front of it, leaving Darren with no choice but to stop. His headlights illuminated a crooked porch and a door slightly ajar. "Nope," Darren whispered to himself. "Not doing this." He threw the car into reverse, but the engine sputtered and died. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging him into darkness. He frantically turned the key in the ignition, but the car wouldn't start. The only sound was his ragged breathing and the faint creak of wood coming from the house. A light flickered on inside, casting a dim glow through one of the broken windows. Darren froze. There was no way anyone lived here. He stayed in the car, trying to convince himself it was safer inside. Then he heard the voice. "Help me." It was faint, barely audible, but it was there, coming from the house, a woman's voice, trembling and weak. "Please, help me." Darren's mind raced. It could be a trap. It had to be a trap. But what if it wasn't? What if someone really was in there, injured, needing help? He cursed under his breath, grabbing his phone. No signal. The voice came again, louder this time. "Please, I'm hurt." Against every instinct screaming at him to stay put, Darren grabbed a flashlight from the glove box and stepped out of the car. The cold night air bit at his skin, and the stench was overpowering now, like decaying meat. He crept toward the house, the gravel crunching under his boots. The porch groaned under his weight as he stepped onto it, and the door swung open wider with a long, agonizing creak. Inside, the light flickered erratically, casting shadows that danced along the walls. "Hello?" Darren called, his voice shaking. "Is someone there?" No response. He stepped inside, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The air was damp and heavy, the walls stained with something dark. The furniture was broken, the floor littered with debris. The voice came again from upstairs. "Help me." Darren's stomach churned as he ascended the creaking staircase. Every step felt like a mistake, but he couldn't stop. At the top of the stairs was a single door, slightly ajar. The light spilled from the cracks, bathing the hallway in an eerie glow. He pushed the door open. The room was empty. Just a chair in the center, its legs splintered, and a rope hanging loosely from the ceiling. Darren's flashlight flickered, and his breath caught in his throat. The door slammed shut behind him. He spun around, but no one was there. The light in the room began to pulse, growing brighter and brighter until it was blinding. And then it went out. In the pitch darkness, he heard it, a low, guttural laugh, followed by the sound of something sharp scraping against the walls. Darren never made it back to his car.